sign it, or lose everything. That was the moment my name stopped feeling like mine, the pen trembling between my fingers as the paper blurred beneath the cold fluorescent lights, my heartbeat so loud I could barely hear the man standing across the table, but I knew his voice anyway, smoothly patient, like this was just another business deal and not the end of my life, not the moment everything I had left was being taken from me inch by inch, my palm damp against the pen as I tried to steady my hand, but it wouldn't stop shaking, because this wasn't just a contract, it was a cage, and I could feel it closing before I even signed, the air in the room too still, too quiet, like even the walls were watching, like they already knew I wasn't walking out the same person, and maybe I had known it too the second I stepped inside, when the door shut behind me with that soft, final click that sounded louder than any slam, louder than any warning I had ignored to get here. I should have run then, should have turned around. But I didn't. Because people like me don't get to run, not when there's a hospital bill with your little brother's name on it sitting unpaid on your kitchen table, not when the bank account hits zero and the calls don't stop coming, not when your father's mistakes follow you like a shadow you can't outrun. So I stood there instead, across from Victor Hale, watching him adjust his cufflinks like time belonged to him, like this moment belonged to him, his smile polite but empty, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that makes your stomach drop before your mind can explain why, and I felt it then, that quiet understanding settling deep in my chest. This wasn't negotiation, this wasn't choice, this was already decided. It's simple. Emily, he said, sliding the document closer to me, his voice calm, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. You sign, the debt disappears. You don't, things get complicated. Complicated. He said it like it was just paperwork, like it wasn't my home, my brother, my entire future hanging in the balance, like I wasn't standing there with everything I loved balanced on the edge of a pen stroke, my throat tight. As I glanced down at the contract again, the words swimming together, legal language wrapping around something much darker, something permanent, marriage in ink but ownership in everything else, my chest rising too fast, too shallow, as I forced myself to breathe. Because panic wouldn't help me now, nothing would, and that was the worst part, realizing there was no way out, not anymore. You're quiet, Victor added, tilting his head slightly, studying me like I was a problem he'd already solved. And I swallowed hard, my voice barely steady when I finally spoke. You're asking me to sign my life away, and he didn't even hesitate, didn't flinch, just gave a small, almost amused exhale. No, Emily, he said softly, I'm giving you away to keep it. And something inside me cracked at that, something small but important, because he believed that, or at least he wanted me to, and maybe that was the most dangerous part of all, the way he could make this sound reasonable, the way he could dress control up as salvation, my fingers tightening around the pen as I stared at the line where my name was supposed to go, the ink waiting, patient, inevitable, and for a second, just 1 second, I thought about refusing, about dropping the pen and walking out no matter the cost. About choosing myself for once instead of cleaning up someone else's mess, but then I saw my brother's face in my mind, heard his laugh, remembered the way he tried to pretend everything was fine even when it wasn't. And just like that, the fight drained out of me, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, something that felt a lot like surrender, my hand lowering slowly toward the paper as the room seemed to hold its breath with me, as if even the silence was waiting to see what I would do. And that's when it happened, not a sound, not a warning, just a feeling, like the air shifted, like something unseen had stepped into the room without opening the door, and for the first time since I walked in. I hesitated, not because of Victor, not because of the contract, but because suddenly, inexplicably, it felt like someone else was watching too, someone who hadn't spoken yet, but already knew everything. The feeling did not go away, it settled deeper, heavier, like a shadow stretching across the room without a source, and my hand froze just inches above the paper, the pen hovering there as if it suddenly weighed 10 pounds instead of a few ounces, my breath catching in my throat as I lifted my eyes, not fully, just enough to glance past Victor's shoulder toward the glass wall behind him, because there was something there, I could feel it, the kind of awareness that makes your skin prickle before your mind understands why. And at first I thought it was just my nerves, just the pressure finally breaking through, but then I saw the reflection, faint, almost invisible in the dim light, a figure standing still on the other side of the glass, tall, unmoving, watching, and my heart skipped in a way that had nothing to do with fear of the contract and everything to do with the unknown presence I could not explain. Is there a problem? Victor's voice cut through the silence, sharper now, less patient, and I blinked, forcing my attention back to him, but the image lingered in my mind, that silhouette, composed, controlled, like he had been there the entire time, like he had seen every second of this unfold, and something about that thought made my chest tighten in a different way, not panic, not exactly, something colder, more focused, like instinct whispering that this moment was not as contained as Victor believed. No, I said quietly, though my voice felt distant even to me, like I was hearing it from somewhere else, and I lowered my gaze again, the contract waiting, the line empty, my name still mine for a few seconds longer, my fingers tightening as I tried to ignore the strange pull in the room, the invisible shift I could not explain, because none of it changed what was in front of me, none of it changed what would happen if I refused, and I did not have the luxury of uncertainty, not when everything was already on the line. Then sign it, Victor said, his tone firm now, the kindness gone, replaced by something colder, something that made it clear patience was running out, and I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because I knew he was right. In the only way that mattered, this was happening whether I was ready or not, and I could either drag it out or end it now, and ending it now felt easier, even if it meant losing something I could never get back, my hand finally lowering the last inch. The tip of the pen touching the paper, the ink blooming instantly, dark and permanent, and for a second I just stared at it, at that tiny mark that meant everything, that meant there was no undoing this, no rewinding, no pretending it never happened, and my chest tightened again, sharper this time, but I forced myself to move, forced the pen to continue, one letter at a time, slow, deliberate, like I was carving it into stone instead of paper. E, then M, then I. My vision blurring slightly as my name took shape in a way it never had before, not just identity but surrender, not just ink but consequence, and somewhere behind me, beyond the glass, beyond the reflection, I felt it again, that presence, still watching, still silent. Like it was waiting for something, for me to finish, for the moment to lock into place, and just as I reached the last letter, just as the pen dragged across the final line of my name, the air changed again, sharper this time, undeniable. Like the room itself had taken a breath, and before I could process it, before I could even lift my hand from the paper, there was a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, controlled click of a door opening somewhere behind Victor, a sound that did not belong to him, did not belong to this moment, but somehow carried more weight than everything that had happened so far, and Victor paused, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking toward the source. His confidence faltering in a way so subtle most people would not notice, but I did, because I was already on edge, already listening for anything that did not fit, and in that split second, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the balance of it, like whatever control Victor thought he had was no longer entirely his, and I realized, with a slow, dawning certainty that sent a chill down my spine, that whoever had been watching was no longer content to stay unseen. The silence that followed was not empty, it was controlled, deliberate, like the kind of silence that only exists when someone powerful decides to let it, and I felt it settle over my skin as Victor slowly turned his head toward the door, his expression tightening just enough to betray that something had shifted beyond his expectations, and I realized then that whatever was happening was not part of his plan, not something he had orchestrated, and that realization alone made my pulse quicken in a way that felt dangerously close to hope, the kind I had no right to feel, not here, not now, not after I had already signed, but it was there anyway, flickering quietly beneath the fear, and then I saw him, not through reflection this time, not as a shadow behind glass, but clearly, unmistakably, as he stepped into the room with the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood, tall, composed, dressed in a way that spoke of precision rather than display, every detail intentional, every movement measured, and yet none of that was what held the room. It was the way everything else seemed to adjust around him, the way even the air felt different, like it had been waiting for him to arrive, and for a moment no one spoke, not Victor, not the men standing near the walls, not even me, because something about him demanded silence without asking for it, and my breath caught again, not from fear this time, but from the sudden awareness that this was the presence I had felt before, the one who had been watching, the one who had seen everything. You started without me, he said finally, his voice low, even, not raised, not sharp, but it carried across the room with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. And Victor straightened slightly, his earlier confidence returning in pieces as he forced a thin smile. This is a private matter, he replied, his tone controlled but strained at the edges. I do not recall inviting you, and the man's gaze shifted. Then, slow, deliberate, moving from Victor to the table, to the contract, to my hand still resting near the ink that had not yet fully dried, and when his eyes lifted to meet mine, the world seemed to narrow to that single point, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that felt far more dangerous than anger, and I felt something inside me still, like my thoughts had paused just to catch up with the weight of that look. You do not need to invite me, he said after a moment, his voice unchanged. When the situation involves something that belongs under my oversight, and the word oversight lingered in the air, heavier than it should have been, and I saw it land, saw the way Victor's jaw tightened, the way the men near the walls shifted subtly as if recalculating their positions without moving at all, and for the first time since I walked into that room, Victor looked uncertain, just for a second, just enough for me to notice, and that small crack in his control felt louder than anything else that had happened. This has nothing to do with you, Victor said, firmer now, as if repeating it could make it true, and the man stepped closer, not rushed, not aggressive, just one step. But it was enough to change everything, enough to redraw the invisible lines in the room, and I realized then that whatever authority Victor thought he had was being quietly, effortlessly challenged, not with force, not with threats, but with presence alone. Everything that happens in this city has something to do with me, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove it, just a simple statement delivered with the kind of certainty that made arguing against it feel almost pointless, and my chest tightened again, but this time it was different, not the suffocating pressure from before, but something sharper, clearer, like the moment before a storm breaks, and I glanced down at the contract again, at my name written there in black ink, and for the first time since I signed it, I wondered if it really meant what I thought it did, if it was as final as it had felt just seconds ago, or if something, or someone, had just walked into the room and changed the meaning of everything. Victor laughed, but it came a second too late, a fraction off from the smooth confidence he had been wearing all night, and that tiny delay said more than anything else he could have said. You are overstepping, he replied, his tone sharpened now, controlled but strained beneath the surface, like he was trying to hold something together that was already slipping, and I watched as his hand moved toward the contract, subtle, almost instinctive, as if touching it would anchor the situation back in his favor, as if the ink on that page still belonged to him. The agreement is already signed, he added, tapping the paper lightly. It is done, and for a brief second, I felt it again, that sinking weight in my chest, the reminder of what I had just done, the reality I could not undo. But the man standing across from him did not react the way I expected. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not even glance at Victor's hand. Instead his attention shifted back to me, steady, deliberate, as if I were the only variable in the room that mattered, and something about that focus made it hard to breathe, not because it was threatening, but because it felt too precise, too intentional, like he was seeing more than I wanted anyone to see. You signed under pressure, he said, not asking, not guessing, just stating it like a fact already confirmed, and my lips parted slightly before I could stop myself. A quiet instinct to respond, to explain, but no words came out, because what was there to say that had not already been written across my face, across my hands, across the way I still had not fully stepped back from the table, and Victor's expression tightened. Further, she signed willingly, he cut in quickly, too quickly, and that was when I knew he felt it too, the shift, the loss of control. There were no threats, he added, his voice firmer now, louder, as if volume could restore authority. But the man did not even look at him, not yet. Willingly, he repeated softly, and the words sounded different coming from him, heavier, like it carried a definition Victor had not considered, and finally, slowly, his gaze moved back to Victor. Then you will not mind if we review the terms, he said, and it was not a request, not even close, and something in the room tightened immediately, like a string pulled too far, ready to snap, and I felt my pulse pick up again, faster now, not from fear alone but from the growing awareness that this moment was stretching beyond anything I had imagined when I walked in. that the line I had signed might not be as final as it had seemed just minutes ago, and Victor hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flicking between the man and the contract, calculating, adjusting, searching for a way to regain ground, and then he forced another smile, thinner this time, less convincing, of course, he said, though the words sounded like they cost him something, and he slid the document slightly forward, but his fingers lingered on it for a moment too long before letting go, and I noticed that too, the reluctance, the hesitation, the crack widening just enough to let something else through, and the man stepped closer to the table, close enough now that I could see the fine details, the sharp lines of his features, the calm in his expression that never wavered, and when he reached for the contract, his movements were unhurried, precise, like he had all the time in the world, like this outcome had never been in doubt for him, and as the paper lifted from the table, the faint sound of it shifting seemed louder than it should have been, like the turning of a page in a story that was no longer being written by the same hand, and I realized then, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my chest, that whatever came next, whatever decision was about to be made, it would not belong to Victor anymore. The paper made a soft sound as it shifted in his hand, barely audible, but somehow it echoed through the room like something far more significant, like the quiet beginning of a change no one could stop once it started, and I watched him as he looked down at the contract, not skimming, not rushing, but reading it with a level of attention that made every second stretch longer than it should have, my pulse beating in uneven rhythms as I stood there, unsure whether to breathe or speak or move. Because everything felt suspended, like the outcome of my life was being decided in the silence between his eyes scanning each line, and for the first time since I walked into that room, I realized I was no longer looking at the paper, I was looking at him, at the way his expression remained steady, controlled, as if nothing written there surprised him, as if he had already expected every clause, every hidden condition, every word that had trapped me just minutes ago. And that realization made something inside me shift again, not fully hope, not yet, but something close enough to feel dangerous. Interesting, he said finally, his voice low, measured, and the single word carried more weight than any argument Victor had made earlier, and I saw Victor straighten again, his jaw tightening as he tried to recover ground. It is a standard agreement, he replied quickly, his tone sharper now, defensive in a way it had not been before, legally binding, properly witnessed. There is nothing unusual about it, and I felt my chest tighten at that, because I had believed that too, or at least I had convinced myself to believe it long enough to sign, but the man did not respond immediately. Instead he turned one page, then another, his fingers moving with quiet precision, until he reached the final section, the part where my name sat in fresh ink, still slightly darker than the rest, and his gaze lingered there for a moment longer than necessary. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow even more decisive. "You are right," he said, and for a split second everything inside me dropped, the fragile sense of something changing collapsing under the weight of those words, until he continued, "It is legally structured," and then he lifted his eyes, meeting Victor's gaze directly for the first time with something that felt unmistakably final, "but it is not enforceable," and the room went still, completely still, like even the air had stopped moving just to hold that sentence in place, and Victor's expression faltered, not subtly this time, but openly, his confidence cracking in a way that could not be hidden. "That is not your decision to make," he said, his voice rising slightly, the control slipping just enough to reveal the tension underneath. But the man did not react to the change in tone, did not match it, did not escalate. He simply placed the contract back down on the table, flat, deliberate, as if returning something that no longer held the same value it had a moment ago. "It already has been made," he replied calmly, and I felt it then, not just a shift, but a reversal, something fundamental turning in a way that made everything before it feel distant, like a different version of the same scene. And I looked down at the paper again, at my name written there, and for the first time since I had signed it, it did not look like a sentence. It looked like something else entirely, something unfinished, something that no longer carried the same weight it had seconds ago, and my breath came a little easier, just a little, enough to remind me that I was still here, still standing, still not completely lost. And when I lifted my eyes again, he was already looking at me, not at the contract, not at Victor, but at me, and there was something in that look that made my thoughts pause, something steady, intentional, like he had not stepped into this room By accident, like this moment had been waiting for him, and I realized then, slowly, carefully, that whatever came next was not just about undoing what had been done, it was about replacing it with something else, something I did not understand yet, but could already feel closing in around me in a way that was different from before, not suffocating, not forced, but controlled all the same. Victor's silence stretched longer this time, no quick response, no immediate denial, just a stillness that felt heavier than any argument he could have made, and I saw it clearly now, the control slipping through his fingers in ways he could not hide anymore. His posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the contract as if staring at it hard enough could force it back into his favor, but it did not move, nothing did, except the quiet shift in the room that had already decided where the power now rested. "You are making a mistake," Victor said finally, his voice lower, more controlled again, but the edge was there, sharper than before, less certain, and for the first time, it sounded like a warning rather than a statement, and the man across from him did not react, did not acknowledge the threat, he simply adjusted the position of the paper slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table with precise, almost absent-minded care, like the details mattered more than the tension surrounding them. "No," he replied calmly, "the mistake was assuming she had no alternative." And the words landed differently, not loud, not aggressive, but final in a way that made my chest tighten again, because they were not just directed at Victor, they were directed at me too, and I felt it, that shift in meaning, that subtle change in direction, as if the path I thought I had been forced onto was no longer the only one in front of me, and I did not know what to do with that, did not know how to stand in a moment where something impossible had just become possible. "There is no alternative," Victor insisted, stepping forward now, his composure thinning as urgency began to replace calculation. "The debt is documented, the terms are agreed upon," she signed. "You cannot simply walk in and rewrite what has already been done," and I felt the weight of his words, the logic of them, the structure I had believed in just minutes ago, but the man did not argue against the facts, he simply looked at him, steady, unhurried, like he was watching a conversation unfold that had already reached its conclusion. "I am not rewriting anything," he said, his voice even, controlled. "I am correcting the imbalance," and something in that sentence settled deep inside me, something that felt unfamiliar and yet undeniable. Like a truth I had not allowed myself to consider before, and Victor exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through now. "This does not concern you," he said again, but the repetition sounded weaker this time, less convincing. And the man finally shifted his attention fully back to me, not to Victor, not to the contract, just to me, and for a moment everything else faded, the room, the tension, the voices, all of it narrowing down to the way he held my gaze without pressure, without demand, but with a certainty that made it impossible to look away. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question caught me off guard, simple, direct, completely out of place in the middle of everything else, and I hesitated for a second before answering, my voice quiet but steady. "Emily," and he nodded once, as if confirming something already known. "Emily," he repeated, and the way he said it felt different, like my name had just been placed into a context I did not understand yet. "Did you choose this?" he asked, and the question hung there, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it cut through everything, the contract, the debt, the pressure, all of it reduced to a single answer I could not avoid, and my throat tightened as I looked down briefly at the paper, at my signature, at the choice I had convinced myself I had made, and for a moment I almost said yes, almost followed the path that had been laid out for me, but something stopped me, something small but unyielding, and when I looked back up at him, the word came out before I could overthink it, "No," and the room shifted again, subtly but completely, like that single answer had just undone more than the ink ever could, and I felt it in the silence that followed, in the way Victor did not immediately respond, in the way the man's expression did not change but somehow became even more certain, and that was the moment I realized, with a clarity that made my breath catch, that whatever happened next was no longer about what I had signed, it was about what I had just said. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, fragile but undeniable, and I felt it echo through me as if I had just done something irreversible, something far more dangerous than signing that paper, because this time it was not ink, it was my voice, and I could not take it back, no, and the silence that followed was different now, not heavy with pressure, but sharp with consequence, and I saw it in Victor's face, the shift from control to calculation to something closer to Irritation, because this was not how it was supposed to go, not for him, not anymore. That is irrelevant, he said quickly, stepping forward again, trying to reclaim ground that had already moved beneath him. She signed, that is what matters. But the man did not even look at him this time, not immediately, his attention still on me, steady. Unwavering, like my answer had confirmed something he had been waiting for, something that made the rest of the room almost secondary, and for a second, just a second, I felt seen in a way that was unfamiliar, not as a problem to solve or a liability to manage, but as a decision that had just been made, and it unsettled me more than anything else had, because I did not understand what it meant yet. It matters, he said calmly, finally shifting his gaze back to Victor, and there was something different in his tone now, not louder, not harsher, but more defined, like the line between what would and would not happen had just been drawn. Consent is not silence, he continued, and it is not fear. And the words landed with a precision that made it impossible to ignore their meaning, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from panic this time, but from the realization that he had just said out loud what I had not been able to, what I had buried under logic and necessity and survival. And Victor exhaled sharply, the frustration no longer hidden. You are turning this into something it is not, he said, his voice colder now. This is business, nothing more. And the man tilted his head slightly, as if considering that, as if giving the statement the attention it did not deserve. Then let us treat it like business, he replied, and with that, he reached into his jacket, not rushed, not dramatic, just a simple motion that somehow shifted the entire room again. And when his hand came back out, there was no threat, no weapon, just a slim folder, dark, structured, placed carefully on the table beside the contract, and the contrast between the two was immediate, unmistakable, one representing something forced, the other something controlled, intentional, and I felt my breath catch again as he opened it, turning it slightly so both Victor and I could see. The debt, he said, his voice even, is now mine, and for a second, I did not understand, the words taking longer to process than they should have, as if my mind needed time to catch up to the shift in reality, and then it landed, fully, completely, and my pulse spiked in response, because that was not just a statement. It was a transfer of power, a quiet but absolute redirection of everything that had brought me into this room, and Victor's reaction was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but sharp, contained, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the documents, then back at the man. You cannot simply take over an agreement without negotiation, he said, but there was uncertainty there now, unmistakable, and the man did not argue, did not explain, he simply let the silence sit for a moment before responding. It has already been negotiated, he said, and there was no room in his tone for doubt, no space for challenge, just the calm certainty of something that had been decided before any of us realized it was happening, and I stood there, caught between the contract I had signed and the one that had just been placed beside it, feeling the shift not just in the room but inside me, because this was no longer about being trapped, it was about being moved, repositioned in a way I did not control, and when I looked at him again, really looked this time, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before, that this was not rescue in the way I had imagined, not freedom in the way I had hoped, this was something else entirely. Something quieter but just as powerful, and as his eyes met mine again, steady, unreadable, I realized with a slow, dawning certainty that made my breath catch, that I had not been released from a contract, I had just been transferred into another one. The words settled slowly, like dust after something had already fallen, and I felt them sink into me in a way that made it hard to tell whether I should feel relieved or more afraid than before, because nothing about this felt simple, not anymore. Not after the balance of everything had shifted so completely without warning, and I stared at the new folder on the table, at the clean edges, the untouched pages inside, and it felt different from the contract I had just signed, not because it was safer, but because it was controlled in a way that made it harder to predict, and I swallowed, my voice quieter than I expected when it finally came out. What does that mean? And for a moment, no one answered, the question hanging there, heavier than anything else. Because it was not just about the debt, not just about the paperwork, it was about everything that came with it, everything that had just changed without my permission, and the man looked at me again, steady, composed, like he had expected the question, like he had been waiting for it. It means, he said slowly, you are no longer obligated to him, and the words should have felt like relief, they should have lifted something off my chest. But they did not completely, because there was something else in his tone, something unspoken, something that made the space between those words feel unfinished, and I felt it before he even continued, but, he added, and there it was, the part that mattered. The part that made my pulse pick up again. The responsibility does not disappear, and I felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath me had changed shape without moving, and I glanced down at the two sets of documents, the one I had signed, the one he had placed, and the difference between them felt less like freedom and more like direction, like being moved from one path to another rather than stepping off entirely. You transferred it, I said quietly, the realization forming as I spoke, and he nodded once, not denying it, not softening it, just confirming it with the same calm certainty he had carried since the moment he walked in, and Victor let out a short, controlled breath, his patience finally thinning to the point where it could not be hidden anymore. This is absurd, he said, his voice tight. You are interfering in an agreement that has nothing to do with you, and you expect me to accept that you can simply take over without consequence. But the man did not respond to the frustration, did not engage with it, because he did not need to. The outcome had already moved past negotiation, and I saw it then, clearly, the difference between the two of them, one trying to regain control, the other never having lost it, and it made something inside me settle in a way that was both grounding and unsettling at the same time, because it meant this was real, this change, this shift, this new direction I had not chosen but was now standing in. You have already been compensated, he said finally, his voice even, addressing Victor without looking at him, and the statement landed like a conclusion rather than an argument, and Victor's jaw tightened again, but this time he did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided, and the silence that followed felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved in a way that left no room for reversal, and I realized then that whatever connection had tied me to Victor was already gone, severed not by force but by something quieter and far more absolute, and I exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment how tightly I had been holding my breath, but the release was incomplete, because the space it left behind was not empty, it was filled with something else, something I could not yet define, and when I looked back at the man, at the calm in his expression, at the certainty in the way he stood there like this had always been the outcome, I understood something that made my chest tighten all over again, that this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something I had not agreed to, and yet was already a part of, and as his eyes met mine one more time, steady, deliberate, I felt the weight of that realization settle in fully, clear and undeniable, that I had not escaped the contract. I had just stepped into a version of it where the rules had changed, but the control had not. The room felt different now, quieter but not calmer, like everything that needed to be said had already been decided without being spoken out loud, and I stood there, still, my hands no longer trembling but not steady either, just suspended somewhere in between, as if my body had not yet caught up with the reality shifting around me, and Victor finally stepped back, not in defeat, not openly, but enough to show that whatever hold he thought he had was gone, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary, sharp, calculating, like he was memorizing something he no longer controlled, and then he turned away without another word, the sound of his shoes against the floor fading into the same silence that had swallowed everything else. And just like that, the chapter one thought would define the rest of my life closed without ceremony, without resolution, just absence, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the space he left behind but not knowing what to do with it, because the relief I expected was incomplete, replaced by something else, something heavier, more deliberate, and when I looked back at the table, at the contract I had signed, it was still there, but it no longer felt like the center of anything, it was just paper now, just ink. Something that had already lost its power the moment someone else decided it would, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant my life could be rewritten that easily, that quietly, without me having any real say in it, and I lifted my eyes again, finding him already watching me, not impatient, not demanding, just present, like he had all the time in the world to wait for me to understand what this meant, and for a second I almost asked the question forming in my chest, almost gave voice to the uncertainty that had been building since he walked in, but the words felt too small, too incomplete. Because this was bigger than a question, bigger than an answer, it was a shift I could feel but not yet define. You should not stay here, he said finally, his voice calm, cutting through the silence with the same controlled ease as before, and I blinked, the simplicity of the statement grounding me in a way nothing else had, and I nodded slightly, though I had no idea where else I was supposed to go, because the life I had before this room felt distant now, altered in ways I could not undo. Come with me, he added, not as a command, not quite, but not a suggestion either, something in between, something that assumed movement rather than waiting for permission, and I hesitated for just a second, just long enough to feel the weight of the choice in front of me, because this time there was a choice, not like before, not forced, not cornered, but still not entirely free, and I looked at the door Victor had disappeared through, then back at the man standing in front of me, and I realized something quietly, something that settled deep in my chest with a clarity I could not ignore, that staying meant nothing, and leaving meant everything, and neither option returned me to who I had been before, and that was the moment I understood, not fully,